expected to establish a ground norm, a foundation for action, a policy declaration, a statement of position of the government. But whatever legislation you look or you take and look at in its own right requires certain actions by institutions and agencies for its effective implementation, for it to effectively come to life. Now, when you talk of democracy in its own right, as established by our Constitution, that governance and leadership in the Nigerian state context should be on the basis of democracy and social justice. Without complementing legislations, without supporting guidelines, without supporting executive orders, there is no way you can bring the constitutional declaration and context of democracy and social justice into action, into life. And that, in effect, makes what necessary, makes further legislations necessary, and that was indeed what brought about the Electoral Act into place for the purpose of fine-tuning the processes of achieving the democracy as enshrined in the Constitution. And what happens further to the Electoral Act? The electoral guidelines that are being periodically developed by INEC as an institution for the purpose of what? Seeing that the democratic culture established by the Constitution is now made a reality. So you can now see that legislations in their own right requires certain collaborative institutional actions for them now to be efficiently deployed into action and into reality. Now, when you talk of an autonomy, for example, of the state legislature arising from Section 121 subsection 3 of the Constitution, take it that the Constitution establishes that there should be autonomy, financial autonomy for the state judiciary and state legislature. The question is there no demand, is there no request for institutional action to bring it to effect or to life? And that is where perhaps further supporting legislative process, or indeed executive order process, or perhaps executive directions or directives and instructions comes into play to complement, support, and enhance and ensure the realization of the ground norm, the realization of this constitutional provision as established in the Constitution. So what I'm trying to say, or level to say in essence, is the legislations in their own right requires certain actions, either executive, legislative, or indeed judicial, for that matter, for the purpose of bringing them to effect, bringing them to life, and fine-tuning the process, and ensuring at the end of the day that the concept envisaged by the main legislation is indeed achieved. So if you are now talking of the autonomy of the state legislature and the state judiciary as contained in the Constitution simply says there should be autonomy and financial independence. Is it enough? What comes to question is, how do we now realize and effect it? And then the Constitution, in its own right, has gone further to provide an answer. Section 5 is categorical that the maintenance and execution of the Constitution is the responsibility of the President. So if the President has a responsibility to maintain and execute the Constitution, and then the Constitution goes further in Section 121 to Section 3 to state that there exists an autonomy, or the autonomy of the state legislature and judiciary is now recognized. Is it not in essence the responsibility of the president arising from his executive powers within the context and spirit of Section 5 of the Constitution to maintain and execute the provision of Section 121 as it relates to the autonomy. So in essence, Section 5 of the Constitution that vests the power and the responsibility on the president to maintain and execute the Constitution has further responsibility using the instruments, establishments, and institutions at his disposal to ensure the realization of the provision of Section 121 of Section 3, and that stands the position of the law. Except perhaps if you are saying in essence that the constitutional powers vested in the president of maintaining and executing the Constitution does not indeed have, the president does not have those constitutional power. But where the president is vested with the constitutional power to maintain and execute the Constitution, and the Constitution says there should be autonomy for the state legislature and state judiciary, the president has extraordinary powers, has additional powers and responsibility to bring to bear the existing institutions, establishments, and perhaps legislations to ensure.
Just before you comment, Honorable Minister, let's clarify this for the purpose of some of our viewers who may not have legal or constitutional background.
Yes.
When you referenced repeatedly Section 5, vesting in the president the powers to enforce or implement the provisions of the Constitution, you need to clarify that, because the governors, who are also members of the executive, also have powers to also implement and enforce the Constitution. So Section 5 relates to the executive, so that somebody doesn't wake up and say, you're a governor, you don't have powers to enforce or implement the Constitution.
Well, as you rightly stated, indeed, the powers to maintain and execute the Constitutions are collective responsibilities. But the issue is, does the Constitution, in one way or the other, derogate the powers of the president as it relates to the execution and maintenance of the Constitution? The answer is it does not. So if perhaps the state governors do indeed have constitutional powers to maintain and execute the Constitution as well, so it calls for what? Collaboration, collaborative action in indeed maintenance and execution of the Constitution. So within the context of collaboration, the responsibility both of the president and the governors is to see to the enforcement of the autonomy as established by Section 121, and not to negate, derogate, or undermine that autonomy within the context of the Constitution. So the governors do not indeed have the powers to derogate or perhaps undermine the autonomy that has been established by the Constitution, but to work in tandem, in collaboration and cooperation with the president in ensuring that the autonomy that has indeed been established by the Constitution is indeed established. So the context of execution and maintenance of the Constitution has been commonly shared by the president and indeed the governors is that of collaboration in seeing to the execution of the spirit of the Constitution and not otherwise.
Honorable Minister, actually, you've done that explanation, elaborately, but then collaboration is optional here, from what I can understand as a layman, because we're talking about executive powers, domiciled and the presidency, and of course at the level of the state governors, as the case may be. And that is one of the reasons why some policies, some national policies, do not cascade down to the state and local government level to be able to, of course, impact positively on Nigerians, the common Nigerians, who are more in the...
I was going to ask you a last question, but there's a temptation for me to double-barrel the question. On the basis of what you guys have said today with regard to the essence and true value of executive orders being an actuating factor in the implementation of the provisions of the Constitution or the law. And you've also referenced excessively Section 121, subsection 3, which authorizes or guarantees rather judicial and autonomy, as well as autonomy for the state legislatures. Professor Akinsheye George has talked about what we see at the state levels. Section 7 of the Constitution states unambiguously that a system of local government is constitutionally guaranteed, that's democratically. But we have seen that observed in the breach. And if you were to go to the 4th schedule to the Constitution, you also see the functions of local governments listed therein. But we have also observed that more in the breach at the state level. Might the President consider an executive order to give real effect to Section 7 and the 4th schedule of the Constitution? That's one question. You may say yes or no. But the other leg of my question is not related to this. I imagine that you have sweated a lot in chasing the Abacha loot, in trying to sign mutual legal assistance, in terms of dealing with anti-corruption issues. And much more lately, and it's still ongoing, is the P&ID issue, which has been referred to as a scam. How much sleepless nights have you had on this? But first take the executive order, whether it's forthcoming on Section 7, as well as 4th schedule to the Constitution.
Well, the key word you used in the course of your submissions of recent is operating in breach. And I think we are where we are today substantially and fundamentally on account of impunity that has indeed deepened into the system over time. A situation where the system is not allowed to operate efficiently and effectively within the context of the law is what indeed is bringing us sleepless nights in governance and administration. Relating to the autonomy of the local government you raised, you can see visibly that the system is not operating efficiently, notwithstanding the constitutional provision that guarantees the system, that guarantees the
democratically
instituted local government administration. So it is indeed not out of place for the President to consider the possibility of bringing about the executive orders, regard being had to the fact that they have proven to be effective tools in complementing the operation of the Constitution. We have seen what ease of doing business executive order has done to the Nigerian rating internationally as it relates to the ease of doing business. So, relating to the Abacha loot, for example, and P&ID, for that matter, they were all products of impunity and operating in breach. And indeed, truly, the true position of things is I, as the Attorney General of the Federation Minister of Justice, have been having sleepless nights over same. Sleepless nights in the sense that these are resources that are taken away from Nigeria illegally and illegitimately, and then we are now forced by the circumstances to negotiate and make extraordinary concessions for the purpose of bringing them back, which in effect has perhaps questioned our sovereignty as a nation. These are cases that now have the capacity to bring and pull down our economy for good, just because someone has decided to operate in breach, someone has decided to bring about impunity in discretion as a government officer. So indeed, the truth of the matter is, I think, what the President has succeeded in doing by way of giving effect to executive orders is to ensure things are properly done, is to displace breaches, displace infractions, and bring about sanity and sanctity as it relates to the operation, enforcement, and application of our laws.
Yes, Honorable Minister.